By the end of the day, 5 British warships were hit, and one ship, HMS Ardent, was sinking.
And the attacks continued on the next day. The British had positioned anti-aircraft missiles around the bay, but it would be days before these delicate units were operational. On the water, the men had resorted to strapping machine guns onto the ship's rails in a desperate attempt to hit the low-flying Argentinian jets. More conventional anti-aircraft guns, some operated by sailors as young as 17, did score a few successes. But all these efforts did little to blunt the relentless onslaught of the Argentinian Air Force.
The British ships unloading vital supplies for the land campaign made easy.
We watched with lumps in our throats as Antelope raged with fire and finally sank. She was our escort and everybody felt a great loss, as she was more than just a ship to us.
In 4 days, 8 British ships were damaged and 2 sunk. During these attacks, 25 men died and many more were injured. While the British were reeling from the attacks in San Carlos water, the Argentinians were celebrating their triumphs. On the 25th of May, it was Argentina's National Day, a day of patriotic ceremony. And after the successes of their air campaign, Menendez and his troops in the Falklands had even more reason to celebrate.
Subordinación y valor.
But it wasn't over yet. The Argentinian Air Force was preparing another raid that would hit the British land campaign where it really hurt. A massive container ship, the Atlantic Conveyor, had just arrived from Britain. She was loaded with thousands of tons of supplies, but more importantly, the helicopters needed by the British forces to get them to Stanley. She was preparing to go into San Carlos that night. Once in range, they released their Exocets. The missiles locked on to 2 frigates. The ships fired up metal foil to confuse the missiles' radar, and the Exocets veered away. But then they found another target, the defenseless Atlantic Conveyor. Fire ripped through the ship, and all 9 helicopters still on board were destroyed. Thompson was relying on them to carry his men across East Falkland to Stanley. At one stroke, most of his transport had now disappeared. Margaret Thatcher wanted Stanley back in British hands quickly, but the main British force was still 50 miles away.
And with no helicopters, the only way for the troops to get there was to walk. The men had 4 days of hard marching ahead of them. And at the end of this slog, they would have to fight a battle. The British main force of 2,000 men were on the move to Stanley. But one unit of around 500 men was going in a completely different direction. The men of Two-Para weren't heading east toward. The battle that lay ahead of them wouldn't go as planned. The name of the settlement was Goose Green.
The Argentinians had a base at Goose Green because of its strategic importance. It's on a narrow strip of land just 5 miles long by a mile wide. So the Argentinians had stationed an infantry regiment here, centered around a small grassy airstrip.
Goose Green on the map case. Aware of the British landing at San Carlos, the Argentinians reinforced their garrison here at Goose Green, fearing an attack from the north. Ready for a British assault, all they could do now was wait.
The man in command of 2 Para was Colonel H. Jones. Known as H to his men, he was brave but impulsive, and he believed in leading from the front. Jones knew Goose Green would be a formidable target, and he drew up a detailed battle plan. The ground at Goose Green was wide open and featureless, offering little protection. Jones's objectives were the airstrip and the settlement of Goose Green held by the Argentinians. 2 Para was split into several companies. They would fight their way south in the dark and then close in on the airfield. Then they would take the settlement in daylight. But the Argentinians held a strong position on the high ground of Darwin Hill. They were protected by minefields in front and supporting artillery back behind the airfield.
The sun began to rise and light flooded across Goose Green, illuminating the men on the wide open battlefield. The men of 2 Para on the low ground were completely exposed to Argentinian fire and couldn't advance. Somebody had to do something. This memorial marks where Jones fell. As their commanding officer lay dying, it now fell to the second in command, Major Chris Keeble, to lead the men. 2 Para were pinned down out in the open, and they were still a mile short of their objective, the airstrip at Goose Green.
While this was happening, 2 of his other companies moved around to the west to bring pressure on the Argentinians' flank. Slowly, 2 Para pushed forward as Argentinian fighter bombers hit them from the air. Then their luck turned, and they got their first air support of the fight. 2 Harriers swept over the battle and dropped cluster bombs on the Argentinian artillery positions. After 14 hours of intense fighting, the Para's steady progress saw them closing in on the Argentinians. But they'd taken a lot of casualties, and they were utterly exhausted.
That night, Keeble decided on a cunning ploy to try and bluff the Argentinians into an early surrender. He sent a letter to the Argentinian commander. In a highly confident tone, he demanded an Argentinian surrender and warned them that he would bombard them heavily and hold them responsible for any civilian casualties if they went on fighting. Amazingly, the gamble worked. The Argentinians agreed to surrender.
The next day, the Paras were astonished to see over 900 Argentinians, nearly twice their own number and nearly 3 times more than they had expected, lay down their weapons. After 6 weeks under Argentinian occupation, Goose Green was back in British hands, and the soldiers of 2 Para were heroes. But the battle for this tiny place had come at a huge cost.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Wood, Captain James, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan.
More than 70 soldiers were dead, 16 British and over 50 Argentinians.
Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley.
What had begun as a quick raid to seize back the airstrip and liberate the community had turned into a bloody battle in the struggle for the Falkland Islands.
The British had won the first round of their land campaign against all the odds. But ahead of them still was the battle to regain Stanley.
While 2 para had been fighting at Goose Green, the main British force had crossed the island and was now just 12 miles from the capital. But the soldiers knew they faced a tough fight between them and Stanley.
We've got to take Stanley. No stopping us now, I don't reckon.
Got to get it done fast, so the only way to do it is get in there.
Do you have any feelings of apprehension, though?
Oh yes, definitely. Without a shadow of a doubt.
Everything seemed to be going to plan. But then the British campaign suffered a massive blow. What followed was the largest single British loss of life in the war.
Just a few miles away from the troops, 2 landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, were anchored just off this bay. They were packed with nearly 500 troops, reinforcements for the assault on Stanley. These ships should have been offloaded under cover of darkness, but a series of delays and misunderstandings meant they were still here when the sun came up. The Argentinians spotted the ships and called in their air force from the mainland. 2 Argentinian fighter bombers swept in on a deadly bombing run. They caught both ships in broad daylight, packed with troops and ammunition.